Welcome to Telegeography Explains the Internet, the show that explores the business behind all of the ways humans stay connected around the world. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, and my guest today is William Collins, Principal Cloud Architect at Alkira. As you might guess from William's title, our episode today is focused on many issues surrounding cloud and enterprise. As I ask William to delve into the history of enterprise cloud and highlight some key issues in cloud networking and utilization today. William has an interesting perspective coming from the enterprise network side, and we start out with him explaining Alkira and why he thinks it is the greatest company on the planet. Then we get into William's take on the history of enterprise cloud development and its impact on the network team. We spend some time in the podcast on the challenges and solutions to multi-cloud, and then get into supercloud, what that is and what the implications are for enterprise networks. Finally, we also touch on Alkira's extranet as a service and get into some use cases for enterprises who might need this kind of solution. So as a podcaster himself, William was a very clear and easygoing guest, so I hope you will enjoy this episode. Okay, welcome to the show, William.
Really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always great to have a guest with a super professional setup. So you sound great. Thanks for that. I like that. Yeah. William, we always start out the show. I think it's better for my guests to introduce themselves than me to sort of read a potted bio kind of thing. So tell us about yourself, your background in networking, how you came to be a principal cloud architect at Alkira.
Yeah, sure. So I'm really just a nerd trying to make my way in the world. So my background
isn't that true for many of us, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I still have just a huge home lab. A lot of the stuff from studying CCIE like long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
I still lab things up. I have Kubernetes running in the basement.
Nice.
And my background, like going farther back, is really grounded in like network engineering. And then when cloud came along and sort of it didn't just rearrange the table; it flipped it over,
Right.
And then a lot of automation scattered throughout the years. I was on the enterprise side for about 15 years before I came to work at Alkira.
Mm-hmm.
The greatest company on the planet, in my opinion.
All right. Well, that's a great way to start. So, we're a generalist kind of podcast covering all things telecom. So a lot of folks listening are definitely going to know Alkira, but maybe you could just give us kind of the rundown of the greatest company on the planet then. Yeah.
So if you, I'm not going to give a canned answer here.
Yeah, that's
kind
good.
of think about it.
We just have to make sure it passes the PR muster. But other than that, right?
There we go.
Yeah.
So if you look at like the typical enterprise today, they've still got applications running in their data centers, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
Right.
Now, though, you have a proliferation of apps, microservices, running across multiple clouds. You have to connect a hybrid workforce. You still got offices. If you're healthcare, hospital system, you've got hospitals. They never closed down during COVID. They had to keep things going. And then you have these organizations trying to do this transformation, cloud migrations, just constant change. Well, like what Alkira does is it gives you a consistent network across all these areas, across clouds, offices, data centers, and any other network that you wish to connect and operate. And we do it as a service.
Right. And that's your sort of your enterprise customers still need to get to you at a kind of neutral data center kind of thing through DIA or some other kind of connectivity service like that.
Yeah, last mile. So you can connect into Alkira in any numerous ways. You can use vanilla IPsec if you want. Pick your SD-WAN provider if you want to use SD-WAN. If you have a direct connect with AWS today somewhere, it doesn't matter where it's at. We can actually onboard that as a mechanism to getting into our platform as well. So, and that's just part of it. Like the way that I've sort of seen it happen is, enterprises, first problem to solve is, hey, we got to get to the cloud.
Right.
So these are our options to get to the cloud. And then one of the reasons we exist is like once you get dropped off at the cloud, then what?
Right.
There's still a lot of networking in the cloud. It's just the tip of the iceberg. It can get pretty complicated pretty quick, especially when you factor in multiple clouds. So we operate in that area of getting you to the cloud and then also all the networking inside and across clouds as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. We do a little survey of IT infrastructure managers from large multinational enterprises around the world, and one of the things we've asked kind of periodically over the years is basically just how do you connect to your cloud providers? And I'm always surprised to see there's still tons of IPsec as the answer to that question. There's also a fair bit of direct connects through and network service providers, cloud service providers, that kind of thing. But then also like we see, of course, everyone is multi-cloud now. And by everyone, I mean, like, I think literally in our last survey, like 100% of folks were using more than one, sort of infrastructure as a service partner, certainly. But there is this sense that once you get there, then you're done. But that's exactly what you're saying that is not true at all. Right. So
100%. Yeah. I remember the first time that something that just used to drive me nuts. So when I worked on the enterprise side, like cloud came along and it was cool. And you have all this investment and all this marketing and all these cool, shiny things like serverless and the Kubernetes
right.
and all these things on the app side. But when you came down to networking, for the longest time, like you had like a direct connect and a site to site VPN.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
it's like, okay, go piece this together and figure it out for yourself. And that's just like one cloud.
Right.
So, there wasn't a lot of innovation there at the beginning. And, cloud providers have slowly started releasing things
Mm-hmm.
over time, but there's still a gap between, if you're a network engineer, you're thinking BGP, you're thinking route, like how am I really going to build a really good routing topology across all these distinct areas?
Right.
How do I do that when, my options are limited in the cloud? And that's another area we can really help with, in terms of like thinking BGP, routing policy, failover, like doing, sort of meeting the enterprise like where it's at today, but then sort of bringing them along in that cloud journey to get them to, where they want to go,
Right.
get them on that journey.
Yeah, that's key. Is so sort of this is here. What can we actually do with it, and how do we make that work? Right. So that brings me to one of the first things I kind of wanted to dig into, which is just the general evolution of cloud that we've seen. It is one of those things that very often happens in the tech kind of world, which is that a word is very capacious, right? There's a lot that goes into what you're talking about with cloud. So especially since you're coming from the 15 years of experience on the enterprising networking side, I don't know, take us through your sort of impression of what has happened in the last sort of decade plus, from going back to when most compute was happening on premises, to sort of cloud coming along, your impression of it at that time, and where we've ended up now with sort of literally everything as a service. Right?
Yeah, that's a good. So I just thinking back when I got, when I was doing my first, I would say real technology job, like not a help desk or some,
Mm-hmm.
catch and dispatch, but enterprise is going through this transition of the hypervisor. VMware had hit, and we were doing almost like some PTSD coming back with some of this stuff, but like we were doing these like large scale exercises of P to V, physical to virtual migrations
Mm-hmm.
On premises. So your whole infrastructure's bare metal,
Right.
like real, like every server is a server. And
Right.
then virtualization came along and really was just gigantic. Just thinking of, okay, like we can use what we have more efficiently. So then, these companies, the companies I worked for anyway, had these migrate these quarterly things of like, okay, by such and such a date, this much of our infrastructure is going to be virtualized, this
Right.
percentage, and there was all these targets you were trying to hit. So it's funny, like how there's so many comparisons to draw to that time to like now, where
Mm-hmm.
enterprises are
Mm-hmm.
saying, okay, we're digitally transforming, and we want to have this much of our infrastructure that's in the data center. We want to have it cloudified. We want to
Right.
digitally transform and move it into the cloud, and maybe even have a data center exit strategy.
Mm-hmm.
So,
You mean
these are all
removing any
things.
kind of like bare metal or on premises kind of data center utilization at all, basically?
Yeah, and we can maybe circle back to that later in the conversation. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a whole different thing in and of itself. But
Yeah.
yeah, so that you had this evolution of the hypervisor, and then you have like software defined networking that came along. A little rough at first. I
Mm-hmm.
think my first real operationally feasible software defined um, technology that I deployed was SD-WAN, really, that actually worked and actually was okay. Like, we actually transitioned the whole WAN over to this thing,
Mm-hmm.
and it works as expected. It's really useful. Some of the other software defined data center stuff was a little slower. Again, it's your core infrastructure. It takes longer. You
Right.
don't just flip a switch. So
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that. So to give you some context, like we used to run a conference called the WAN Summit that was about bringing together large multinational IT infrastructure teams and carriers, vendors, that kind of thing. And this is 10 years ago, so like 2013, 14, 15. The conversation was all around SDN, and I think a lot of the enterprises in the room were sort of scratching their heads about like, well, what does this mean for me? That sounds like a carrier. We didn't call them hyperscalers back then, but cloud provider kind of problem. It was really SD-WAN that brought what that sort of general idea was to something that the enterprise could actually bite into.
yeah, 100%. It doesn't make for an enterprise unless they can deploy it,
Mm-hmm.
operate it, and support it. It doesn't. It's just not going to happen, especially now these
Right.
days.
Yeah, exactly. Because there are so many moving parts that anybody on the enterprise side is focused on, that something has to be sort of turnkey to be useful at all, right? So
Right. Exactly. And then you have repatriation coming up all the time in the news in the mix as well. And
mhm.
then, introduces all sorts of other questions like, oh, is it 100% on-prem or 100% cloud? And, dare I say that there's a balance to be struck there somewhere, like, okay,
Right.
it's not a zero-sum game.
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
just what is good for the business for this type of application or these use cases.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's sort of if we talk about the sort of current state of enterprise cloud, and sorry if I derailed you from your history at all. If there's anything else you want to bring up there, feel free to. But thinking about the sort of current state of enterprise cloud, it's I think very much that balance of like, rather than thinking of this from a holistic network situation, it's really an application or workload by workload kind of issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you think about, I'll just use one real example. So I worked somewhere, and we're a big company. We had a lot of applications.
Hmm.
These applications were deployed and built and maintained at different times based on whatever technology stack was there at that time over many years.
Right.
So you don't just say, okay, I've got, for us it was over 1,000 applications,
Right.
and you just don't say, hey, I'm going to migrate these to the cloud, and I'm going to have the same process that's going to work for all of them across the board.
Right.
You've got to peel back storage, you've got to peel back all the application dependencies. You really have to profile all those applications, and then you have to have some sort of assembly line of sorts, to say, okay, if we did want to move this application, sometimes I've seen a lot of lift and shift happen in the earlier days, but for some applications, the cost it, would incur to actually rebuild them,
Hmm.
replatform them, just complete redesign. There's a lot of cost associated with that. And if it's, for the business, it's a business decision. Do you want to spend this much to do this thing? And if not, okay, it sits in the data center, or maybe you can lift and shift it.
Right.
So yeah, it can get complicated, but yeah,
So,
no application is ever the same.
yeah, and so to sort of put a pin in that, you're looking at a situation where the whole idea of going back to virtualization and then cloud and X as a service, is that there are economies of scale on the sort of virtualization, digital transformation cloud end that are hard to replicate on the enterprise side. However, you're saying that if the lift and shift process and the redesign that needs to happen to facilitate the application's sort of process changing can overwhelm that sort of potential cost savings, basically.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, some things just again, it all depends on the application, the staffing, and a lot of other things. But yeah, each application just seems to be unique.
Mm-hmm.
And the cloud providers have these frameworks that loosely they're a good type host. I think they're good, and it's basically like you have these assembly lines or these different ways. Like you can either lift and shift, you can replatform, which maybe so lift and shift is just moving everything up to the cloud
Right.
as is. You're not changing a thing.
Right. Right.
Replatform is going to be a little different. Like maybe you peel off the storage and use like a cloud native database that scales, to help you with your synchronous, asynchronous data transfer, high availability DR stuff with storage, which is, quite a challenge sometimes. And maybe the app still lives in a VM, like a 3-tier or something.
Right.
So you've replatformed some of it, but then the complete re-architecture, so the cloud providers have these different assembly lines to where you can kind of think, okay, like, as I'm profiling these applications, I can kind of set them in here, and then I can have a strategy for each one of these things. But I found in practice and actually doing this, it's hard. It's really hard. Data centers are complicated places, I would say.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose sort of related to that would be this complication that comes from, so we're thinking about the networking team impact, right? But then there's issues with shadow IT, that folks have moved workloads to the cloud sort of without the knowledge or imprimatur of the network team. But beyond that, even just there's DevOps and all kinds of other things that fall under the general IT group within an enterprise that have to, I would think, work closely together with the network team and sorting out how all of this ultimately unfolds in that sort of assembly line process. What's your take on that?
That's a really good observation and a really good, yeah. So one thing I noticed in the earlier days of this digital transformation thing is one of I would say a reputation that came along with compute and network and security teams in the data center was, well, they're slowing us down. They're going too slow. One of the things that cloud allows us to do is it allows us to hit the ground running. Okay, we've already got these VMs up. We've already got the application deployed. Great. And, so when you think about being able to move fast like that and, the traditional teams, sort of slowing things down,
Right.
This created a stigma or just sort of a persona of like, we don't need them anymore. We don't need this. And of course, and as long as I've worked in networking, you don't need the network folks until you need the network folks.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
as it turns out, building a ton of stuff in cloud, like a lot of times, like I would get brought in to look at like, okay, the, cloud teams actually took the example 10 dot CIDR range that's in AWS's documentation, and they actually use that same CIDR range on like every VPC. And now we have this unbelievable amount of overlapping IP. Well, the network team didn't even know we were deploying in cloud at the time,
Right.
but now we're being called in because now this VPC that has the same CIDR range as like a wireless network and, on West Coast is, needs to talk to something in the data center, and then you need to transfer data over.
Right.
So then you have these problems you have to solve. So yeah, it was a big thing. And then you see a slow transition of, okay, we need to bring network security and compute into this thing earlier in the process,
Mm-hmm.
so we can get out in front of these things in the future, because hey, this set us back in this project by several months,
Right.
because we created these problems we didn't know were going to be problems. And then from there, you see a lot of the business, like as a whole, taking a more strategic approach with these critical infrastructure pieces, especially networking,
Right.
bringing it in sooner and thinking of it as a strategic, how can we actually enable the success of all these things with really solid built network, an optimized network, one that can do the segmentation we need, one that can
Mm-hmm.
be, maybe it's API backed, we can put some automation around it, we can put some guardrails and controls around it, so it eventually works its way into the strategy.
Yeah. I mean, you made a bunch of great points there, but one that I always like to focus on is that, it seems like we really did have a world before where it's, everyone within the enterprise is saying, here's all the things we want to do, and there'll be network to take care of that. Whereas now the network has become kind of more, has to be integrated into that process. What can the network allow you to do? What are the implications from that network for the security team and all that sort of thing, where it seems like there's a much greater complexity problem of harmonizing different stakeholders but ultimately also that the network can be, rather than the sort of afterthought of like, yes, okay, then under that put a network, kind of an enabler to allow those folks to think about the world in a new way.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, cool. So let's talk about multi-cloud a little bit, since that is I think very much what you guys are focused on. And like I said before, I think multi-cloud is just a fact that is where enterprises all find themselves for various reasons. Cloud providers have different strengths. All the different applications and things that you're doing are going to sort of lend themselves to different hyperscalers and whatnot. So that creates a big challenge along the lines that we've been talking about. What do you see as the sort of challenges that are presented by multi-cloud for the enterprise?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for the longest time, I think enterprises, like, first they found themselves like you didn't have like some big meeting with like a CTO and your VPs and some, like, hey, we're going multi-cloud. That just sounds like a plan. It just
Right.
sounds cool.
It's just something that happened.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just something that happened. And a lot of times, like one company I worked for historically or in the past was, we single cloud. We were doing single cloud actually fairly well. And then, turns out we acquired another company and they were in a different cloud.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're multi-cloud.
Mm-hmm.
And that came on like a storm.
Right.
So yeah, like some of the things, I think, back to what I was saying earlier about like in the data center, hey, BGP, AS path prepend, prefix lists, route maps,
Mm-hmm.
route based policy, active standby because I got some firewalls, stateful things, thinking through these designs and architectures is what networking folks, have done for a really long time.
Right.
And coming into the cloud space, like every cloud is different. So, even the scope in which, subnets. So you create subnets in these cloud providers, and even the basic construct of a subnetwork's different. So some cloud providers will actually span subnets, stretch them across availability zones, whereas, some clouds, like AWS and, Oracle OCI, their subnets are only in scope for one specific availability zone.
Mm-hmm.
This changes a whole architecture of inserting a service or, doing different things. So you have all these different components, which means, at the end of the day, it can be network, it can be storage, it can be any other facet of your technical your tech stack. But you have to make that decision of, okay, am I going to hire a whole bunch of skilled individuals across all these distinct areas?
Mm-hmm.
Or am I going to start bringing in certain products that sort of abstract some of this for me?
Right.
Think like an overlay, like instead of having, this many ways to do security groups or to control or steer traffic, I want one way to do it, which
Right.
is where, products like ours help out.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a great point. I think that applies across the sort of networking space in 2023, which is that even leave aside the kind of economies of scale issue that whether we're talking about multi-cloud or something like SASE, there's just economies of scale for having folks who are focused on that, and constantly updating with the new information and all that. Even if you were like willing as the enterprise, I think to pay for those skills, I don't know if you could find them, right? There's just not enough people with those skills to be in house at all the multinationals that would need them, I would think.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and that's something that I when I haven't been around for as long as some folks,
Hmm.
but when I first started, you tended to have folks that would stay with like one or two companies, like for their like the duration of their entire career.
Right.
Like a lot of folks that were just very loyal to that company. They started help desk and they got up
Right.
to Wintel server or network or wherever, and they just kept with the same company. But now folks move around like crazy.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
how do you, like, if you're an enterprise, like one big challenge, um, I hear a lot about is like, how do you retain talent? Because you need some sort of balance of, uh, existing talent that's been there that understands the architecture. Someone
Yeah.
that's going to stay around for a
Institutional
while, but then you
knowledge,
need
right? Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
100%. But then you need new, fresh sets of eyes as well. So you have to have some sort of balance there
Right.
because you want fresh perspective coming in. But
Hmm.
yeah, finding and retaining top talent right now is very, very hard.
Yeah, well, and certainly that's why I think there's all these tools sort of out there. The market has supplied all these different tools that offer you these kinds of solutions that you don't necessarily need someone in house to understand fully, right? But just to get to and know what to do and how to order it. I mean, ultimately, right? The promise of all of this kind of automation NAS stuff that we're looking at is that a reasonably skilled networking person can just go on a portal and spin things up, right? You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
without having to do all the thinking about the stuff that you're thinking about on the Alkira side, I reckon.
Yeah, and we can we're fully API backed, and you can, if
Hmm.
you want to automate 100% of everything, whether it's Terraform or writing your Python scripts, you can do it. But
Right.
the way that we've built this platform, we have some our engineering team just surprises and impresses me like all the time with how just the level of thought and detail they've gone into making this almost like a no code platform.
Hmm.
As in, you log into the UI and you don't need to write a single line of code if you don't
Right.
want to, because you
Hmm.
can do everything you need from the portal. It's
Right.
that easy.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. Now, of course, there's always that space for like the sort of co-managed model, if you will, like folks that need and can and need to go in there and do a little something. Can you accommodate that as well, basically?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
Everything is identity backed. You know, login, making sure that the whoever's logging in, like they have only access to the things they need.
Hmm.
If your security, having access to the policy and, whatever functions from the security point of view. If your network, having access to the sites. If your cloud, maybe you have access to the cloud networks. Yeah. So breaking that down and making sure that, because with our solution, like we go beyond network,
Hmm.
and that's just a reality. So we, a lot of times we see cloud practitioners that are jumping in and doing things,
Hmm.
security practitioners,
Right.
all, people on separate teams within an organization. So you have to have that control
Right.
for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. All zero trust. I want to sort of move back a little bit to the multi-cloud idea, and I know that that one thing you guys are talking about now is the super cloud sort of end game of multi-cloud. I don't know that all of our listeners will even be sort of familiar with that phrase. I think it's a little bit new, especially if you're not sort of real steeped in the cloud world. What is super cloud, and how did we get there, and what kind of issues does that bring up?
Really good question. And I had a love-hate relationship with the term supercloud. At first, I did not like
Yeah,
it. I was like, we don't need any
yeah.
more words.
So there's already
Just
hyperscalers and it's,
yeah.
yeah,
We've got Gartner
yeah,
that's churning out these
yes,
phrases and things like constantly. So let's just not, but supercloud for me made a lot of sense. Um, from so if you think about the enterprise, in reality, again, it's a reality that spans multiple public
hmm,
clouds, data centers, lots of services. It spans a lot of things. So for me, supercloud is like a additional abstraction layer that sits atop all these distinct areas,
hmm,
in such a way that is operationally sound for that enterprise.
right,
So again, like instead of having 4 or 5 different ways to do things on the network for these areas, okay, I'm consolidating that into one way of doing it.
right,
So, the business can deploy, operate, and support with, some robust, security and the performance that it needs to scale.
hmm,
So, really, I think SuperCloud is like a long term proactive strategy. Whereas, like multi cloud, at least when I was in the enterprise, nobody liked multi cloud because
hmm,
we had to
hmm,
deploy and operate it. It was a nightmare,
right,
and
because
that was,
there's so many different what just like you said that each cloud provider that you're using is not only for different purposes but has different sort of complexities that you have to think about, right?
yeah. So instead of, I'd say like the multi like in framing like multi cloud in the enterprise, it was almost like a problem.
Hmm,
Like we're reacting to a problem. We have this multi cloud problem now, and we've got to come up with something to keep the ship sailing.
right.
Whereas super cloud is more proactive, and it's like a strategy for it in a sense.
Yeah, no one asked me, and for good reason. But I would have, I think I would have called it meta cloud. It seems more like that. That it's not that you're like sort of souping up your cloud. It's more that you're pulling back a layer of abstraction maybe, and allowing things to move across that multi cloud environment without it being a complexity problem. Is that stabbing in the right direction at least?
Yeah, absolutely. I think meta cloud has actually been used a little bit,
Mm.
maybe, or it
Well,
might have a
they
different meaning.
Yeah,
It probably
that's
has
the
some
thing.
different meaning.
Well, it's also in as I'm sure you're well aware. You talk to 10 people in this industry about what an acronym means and or a name, and you get 10 different answers, right? So
Yeah.
SASE
Or if
is
you
my
do zero trust, you might get thousands of different answers.
exactly. I mean, particularly in the security area. Certainly, I know that we've been working on a kind of SASE analysis project here, and definitely. I think the industry is pining for someone to nail down what SASE is exactly. But yeah, yeah. Does SASE work into all of this? What you're doing, since I brought it up, so in terms of not just supercloud, but just in general, sort of those wishing to adopt a SASE posture. Obviously, a lot of that are things like virtual firewalls and CASB and whatnot. How does that play into your vision of where enterprise cloud is right now?
I don't think I don't think super cloud and like multi cloud networking. So SASE basically takes specific security functions that
Hmm.
do like entirely different things. Like you
Right.
said, CASB and like ZTNA,
Hmm.
um, secure web gateways, even SD-WAN. You bundle
Yep.
them together. Usually, a single vendor is like the new buzzword. Oh, it's single vendor
That's
SASE.
exactly what I've been looking to. Who has a
Yeah.
full stack of SASE products? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And so super cloud, or, especially with Alkira, this cloud network as a service, what we do is a little more strategic. So it
Hmm.
says, hey, you have all these areas you have applications running in, multiple clouds perhaps. So instead of doing networking, like I said, in 4 or 5 different ways, let's do it one way.
Right.
So
Right.
instead of having, storage in several different ways across several clouds, let's do it one way. Whereas, and one of the things with, that, our founders, are absolutely brilliant, and looking at and sort of thinking about enterprise is not, enterprise is never going to say, oh, we, want like one vendor. We're just going to
Right.
use one vendor.
Right.
It's always multiple
Hmm.
vendors. I mean, most of the enterprises I worked at like had like several firewall vendors.
Right.
And
Right.
that's where, instead of taking that single vendor approach of we will do all the things for you. We do a lot of integrations with
Right.
best of breed
Right.
solutions that companies are already using.
Hmm.
Palo Altos, Fortinets, inserting and instantiating info blocks, a lot of different awesome, excellent integrations that make our customers' jobs, easier at the end of the day.
Right.
So instead of having to think, okay, we've got to pick a SASE vendor that has, this, and this. Okay, does the ZTNA do this? Okay, does the secure web gateway work like this? We take that approach of, okay, insert what you need, where you need it. It can be multiple vendors if you want. You
Yeah.
don't even need to have any. It's up to you, whatever makes your business run.
No, that's a great point. Another sort of back to that idea that there's the complexity of the IT infrastructure manager has exploded in the past few years, but that the channel partnerships that are in place allow you to sort of select, even maybe on an application by application basis, rather than sort of trying to make everything fit with one kind of lock in sort of provider. I think that's the model that I see really taking off for all of this SASE oriented stuff, especially. So
For sure.
yeah. Now let's also talk about something that was a little bit new to me when we were sort of planning for this podcast. But I'd certainly heard of extranets and that general sort of idea. But I understand you guys have now this extranet as a service. And let's start with just sort of again, since we're a general telecom podcast, and maybe give us a sort of background on what extranets are, what enterprises typically do with them, and then how we get into providing that as a service.
So, you know what I think of when I hear the word extranet? I think of really old Disney movies
All
because that's
right.
about how old extranet is.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Yeah.
extranet has been around. It's been a known quantity for enterprise for like ever since I first started.
Right. Ever
And it's
since
basically
there was an
just
intranet that they needed to expose to anybody else, right? So which has always been the case,
yeah,
right? So yeah.
yeah, always had this need, although it's evolved over time. So it's
Hmm.
basically the network design that you put in place in your data center to securely connect customers, partners, third parties,
Right.
whatever untrusted to various resources internally. And usually thinking of like in the enterprise context, you have your data center and you'll have different pods or different areas. Your data center is usually somewhat modular.
Hmm.
Modular.
Hmm.
Can't talk.
That's
So
all right.
you'll have
We
a
got you. So, yeah. Yeah.
you'll have a module basically for untrusted extranet. Usually it's a separate set of firewalls, maybe
Hmm.
separate routers, usually a whole separate, isolated data center within a data center sometimes that
Right.
everything's going to terminate in on. I've seen even separate circuits for extranet in the historical context of data center. So, that's the sort of the gist of what an extranet is used for.
Hmm.
And we take a different approach as far as if you think of instead of everything coming back to the data center, as it were in the days of old,
Hmm.
partners and third parties may be coming in via their data center or their cloud providers and may need access to connect to resources in your data center or maybe one of your cloud providers.
Hmm.
So how do you do this quickly?
Right.
How do you narrow down the scope of what is being accessed, how it's being accessed, and from where? In the era of cloud and in the era of this proliferation of all these things
Right.
out of the data center.
Right. Without
So
going
these are the
through
challenges
setting
that
up
this
actual
involves.
appliances and all that kind of thing. Right. So,
Yep. So yeah, that's the basically the problems that our extranet as a service solution solves. So this business to business, third party, all these connectivities, making sure everything's secure, grouping everything together, you know, being able to, peel apart, even I mean, even in the context of in business to business is just gigantic, of course.
hmm.
I remember, one of the enterprises I worked in, we had a process for B2B, or we called them land to land connectivity
Mm-hmm.
requests at that time. So we had this process. You'd fill out a form. We'd set up this VPN. We'd sit on a call with this other company and try to. I remember one time I was, setting up connectivity to a Sophos firewall. One time it was a PFSense firewall, and it's like, okay, I'm running. I have an ASA here. Okay, so like we gotta set up connectivity between these two things, and we've got overlapping IP. So we've got to do some level of natting, and by the time all's said and done, all the calls, all the scheduling, you're looking at weeks
Right.
sometimes before
Right.
you can get this business to business connection up.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we take that on as a service.
Yeah. And is that, something that essentially, like all other X as a service things we've been talking about, you can go into a portal, kind of like, spin up within an hour rather than those weeks, and kind of, manage that on an as needed kind of basis, dynamic, that sort of thing.
Yeah, 100%. One thing that I see some of is the way that we do policies, traffic routing, access control, like at the network level. Like we
Mm-hmm.
have these a combination of policies, groups, and this intent based policy engine, and you can basically set up these policies to dictate like whatever outcome you want or whatever should or should not be allowed, things of that nature, without even having to connect the network, without even having the
Right.
connectivity set up to that third party or anybody else. So then you can like reuse that
Right.
um, across subsequent connections that are coming in, which is really useful. And
Mm-hmm.
basically, it's just time management. If you think about it in terms of, how many times do you go to like a new, health insurance changes, you go to
Right.
like a new clinic and you have to fill out everything again. You've got to put your name and your social in like 10 different places and
Right.
like sign all the same forms. So all those small things that just take up a lot of time and can be frustrating, we, take that off the plate and allow you to make repeatable
Right.
chunks out of that to facilitate.
It's a general rule that anything that you have to do more than once should be able to be automated. Right? So, yeah, there's like a broader philosophical issue there. That's like, if you look at the last 100 years of technological economic development, you would think, well, how could we possibly do all the things that we do? But there's always tools that arise to facilitate doing ever more, right? So there were famous for Keynes, the economist, is saying, "Oh, by the year 2000, people will be working like 5 or 10 hours a week because they'll be so productive, or whatever." we find ways to fill all that up, but we have these tools to make all of that possible, right? So, yeah. All right, so William, the last thing I wanted to touch on is just China as a particular market. So in our research, one of the really interesting things that we've seen is that we'll see enterprises who were in, your traditional classic all MPLS kind of networking environment. They've adopted SD-WAN. They want to move to an internet first kind of framework for their network. And they'll do that all around the world. And they say, I can't do that in China because internet is too difficult in China. There's the triopoly. You have to deal with one of them. You have to go through the Great Firewall. Things have to come in and out of Hong Kong, all of that sort of thing. Like I said, before, I'm more, thinking about the WAN and not cloud specifically, but I know cloud is also sort of more difficult in China for all of these reasons. So I wonder if you just, sort of talk about how you guys are operating in China, and what you've done to facilitate enterprise access into cloud in China, knowing that there's probably some extra complications.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. So all cross-border traffic is heavily scrutinized.
Mm-hmm.
IPsec is blocked in AWS in China by
Right.
default.
Right.
ICP licenses are required to use, 443 and 8080. So and then you have the three carriers, and you got to think each customer, you've got to be registered to send traffic over those, these cross-border links. So like what we've done, so first of all, that I would say that, and ever since I've been working with Alkira, I've had a lot of conversations with customers, and this is probably one of the biggest ones that's come up across so many different customers. Like a lot of times you'll have like, okay, maybe these 3 customers, this is going to be useful, or these other 3, this might be useful. But this has been just a unanimous
Right.
pain point
Yeah.
for so many companies.
Everyone has to do
It's
business there more or less, and everyone has these same roadblocks to it. Sometimes kind of literally, right? So, yeah.
exactly. And today's the day. Let me tell you. So today we announced the availability of our, what we call cloud exchange points, or
Hmm.
CXP for short, in China. And what a CXP is it's almost like a virtualized point of presence running on top of these hyperscale, this
Mm-hmm.
hyperscale infrastructure. So, this is, again, it's a huge launch for us, given the importance of China is just a hub for business,
Right.
and the need for reliable and high performance connectivity inside China and abroad. So this is a major challenge today for a lot of these companies, given the regulatory and just the getting things to work. It's very technically complex as well. So you just jump through a lot of you have to jump through a lot of hoops,
Hmm.
from regulatory to putting together a technical design that meets your um, requirements. But to think about, so like, first of all, the benefits, like if you're going to use this over what you're doing today, the first, I would say, in fact, all these benefits are probably unanimous among most companies,
Hmm.
but the
Hmm.
first one is intra cloud. So you have, you're doing business in China in isolation, maybe.
Right.
So you don't
Right.
even need to connect to the rest of the world, and you just need you've gone multi-cloud. In fact, a lot of what we see is just companies trying to modernize.
Right.
So they're trying to make it easier to move to cloud and to operate and to integrate with this hybrid world we live in, with connecting sites, clouds, and services, with this high performance. So using our CXP in China gives you that high performance, high reliability um, connectivity. And the second thing I think that is, probably the bigger pain point, that we solve for is, okay, how do you extend that connectivity between workloads that exist in China
Hmm.
to maybe SaaS sites and operating out of the US, or
Right.
services,
Right.
networks like spanning the globe. So there's ways to do this, but it's really technically complex, requires a lot of operational overhead. It's just complicated. Um, and that leads me into the last thing, is like I think the main benefit, and the reason why a lot of customers are using this now, is the experience. So
Mm-hmm.
even if you pick, like, say, a number of other multi-cloud tools out there, you're usually still deploying like a separate tenant within China, a separate management console, a
Right.
separate way to monitor. It's like a separate everything, in order to orchestrate and to build this stuff up. Let alone if you're doing it DIY, like doing everything yourself, it's much more complicated.
Hmm.
But with Alkira, you get a standardized network and security architecture, across the board, that powers, an identical, completely identical experience between China, like in the networking, across the globe. And we're this is power. So we work, we have some great partners. We're working with CBC Tech to help power the border
Mm.
stuff.
I take it that's a
Um,
Chinese company. I don't, off the top of my head, not familiar with them, but yeah. Hmm.
right. I can, yeah, there's a lot of information about this, and, I'm sure you can put some notes in
Yeah, we
the,
can put it, the press release in the show notes. This show obviously won't come out today, but that press release is coming out today, and so that'll be all ready for public consumption. So.
awesome. Yeah. So yeah, we partner with CBC for the cross border stuff. And yeah, it's just been a really, so if you think about it, like, at the end of the day, the complexity actually doesn't go away.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
it goes away for the end user. It goes
Right.
away for
That's the
whoever's
key.
consuming Alkira.
Yeah.
But like, we're there to do a lot of this tedious stuff on the back end to ensure, performance, to ensure reliability, and to ensure that the I would say the features, like,
Hmm.
the if a service is available in China, say like a Palo Alto, or some aren't available in China, of course.
Right.
But if these vendors do business in China, we can integrate them into this, seamlessly insert them, um, do this service insertion that our customers are used to doing, like in North America as well. So we sort of put together this whole network picture. Just because it's China doesn't mean it has to be completely different,
Right. Right.
and out of a completely out of pocket design. So simplifying operations by bringing it under one portal, one tenant, one way to do it, which is extremely useful.
Yeah, no, I think that ties into what I'm seeing emerge here in our conversation as this overarching theme, that the whole idea is that all these changes in the WAN and in sort of cloudifying everything in the enterprise have introduced all kinds of complexity, but then that's the whole idea, is that then out of that complexity arises folks who can focus on those sort of little areas, and not have that complexity have to fall into the lap of the IT infrastructure team every single time, right? I think is the general idea that people are looking for. So.
Yeah, 100%. Like aiming, for that outcome based,
Right.
economy, that outcome based product. Where you're trying to focus on the outcome more than the all the little mundane details. So many different things, so many different processes, and then it's ends up being just another brownfield, and then we go on with another greenfield that we have to deploy. So
Right.
yeah, thinking about these things in an outcome based way.
Yeah. Well, William, we're running out of time. This has been a really fascinating conversation, but I just kind of want to end on what you see coming in the next couple of years in terms of cloud networking. What enterprises who might be listening here should start to think about if they haven't yet.
Yeah, the network is everywhere, and I know that some enterprises are a little more risk averse or slow to adopt, cloud. Some were slow to like adopt SD-WAN,
Mm-hmm.
and it took a little bit longer. Usually the way that it goes is they say, hey, there's going to be a lot of other companies that are going to build this out, and then we'll learn from
We have to
that, and
watch
then we'll
that
adopt it.
first. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, once it's safe, but then there's some companies that jump in right away, and they're on the bleeding edge of innovation. So the network is everywhere, and I think that you've got to always look out for operations. I think operations is the one area that never gets easier, it seems like.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think of if I'm an enterprise today, I'm asking, okay, can we easily deploy this solution, and can it scale with the pace of the business,
Right.
and it's a performance where it needs to be, what performance is needed to drive the business, and then if we can support the network with our existing solutions, when something breaks, what is the impact, can we fix it? So I think these questions sort of inform the continued evolution of like multi-cloud networking, like where it's going. And those are the things that I know a lot of enterprises are looking at, is like we have to have something we can operate.
Right.
We can't have all these unplanned outages all the time because of all the DIY that we've done everywhere that we forgot about. And, it just doesn't, the world has moved on, and, you have to think about these operations, reliability things, and AI too. I don't want to get, I can't go into a conversation without
Yeah,
saying
that could be
generative
a
AI.
whole other podcast sometime too. So yeah.
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 Yeah. From an operations point of view, though, like I don't want AI dictating how traffic's going to be routed, but
Right.
hey, I don't mind if it's looking at a lot of data, read only, and maybe giving me insights.
Right.
So
Right.
that's another big area.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Excellent. Well, that was really fascinating. Thank you again. How can listeners keep up with you and what you're doing at Alkira?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn, William-Collins, or Twitter or X,
Yeah,
WCollins502.
no one will
And
ever get
then,
used to that, I think. So yeah,
no.
yeah.
And then AlkiraNet for Twitter and for LinkedIn.
Hmm. Excellent.
And also alkira.com. Keep
Right.
up with our blog. We're constantly posting, new any new feature we have or anything new that's coming. We have a pretty awesome blog. So yeah, give it a look.
Yeah, excellent. All right, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. Like I said, maybe think of another topic that we have to hit in that might be AI. We'll see.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Yeah. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Telegeography Explains the Internet comes from the experts here at Telegeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. And I also wrote that theme song you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com, and we'll see you on the internet.